Good evening and welcome to the first virtual open house for the proposed Devereux Meadow Park project. I am Gary Claiborne, Capital Projects Manager for the City of Raleigh Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources. I will be presenting an introduction to the project followed by a presentation from our design consultant team. But before we get too far, I do want to note that this meeting is being recorded so that we may post the video on the city's YouTube channel after this meeting. This recorded video will be for those who are not able to join us tonight and for those of you wanting to rewatch. I'm going to pass this over now to Lindsay Naylor with Design Workshop, who will go over some of the technical issues with Zoom right now.
Great, thank you, Gary. And it looks like we might still be having a few people coming in. And so while we're waiting for everyone to log on and to get settled, I'll just sort of go real quickly through some of the features that you should be seeing within your Zoom webinar interface. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little Q&A button. And so if you click that button, it should open up a little question and answer box. And we'll be using this box to keep track of your discussion questions. So we're saving about an hour after the presentation to address any questions that you all have about the park designs and project. But please feel free to use the Q&A box to send in those questions as you think of them throughout the presentation, and we'll hold on to those for the end. And we will also be using the Q&A box to answer any technical questions that you may have, any other questions that you might have pop up over the course of the presentation. I will be keeping an eye on that Q&A box, so hopefully I can help people resolve any issues that they might be having. So again, that Q&A box is where you go to submit your questions about the park design and the project that you'll want answered later, and also for any technical questions that you have. The one other button that you should see is the view settings in the upper right. You can use that if needed to adjust your view to make sure that you're able to see the full slides clearly. That button is the view settings up in the upper right. And I think that's about it. Thanks, Gary.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lindsay. Since I'm aware that there are a few more people that have been joining us in just the past minute or so, I'll kind of go over my intro again. Good evening and welcome to the first virtual open house for the proposed Devereux Meadow Park project. I am Gary Claiborne, Capital Projects Manager for Raleigh Parks. I will be presenting an introduction to the project followed by a presentation from our design consultant team. And this meeting is being recorded so that we may post this video on the city's YouTube channel after this meeting, and that will be for those who are not able to join us tonight and for those of you wanting to rewatch. So tonight's meeting agenda. For the first part of tonight's meeting, we'll be having a presentation from our project design team detailing an overview of the proposed park project, existing site conditions, and concept plan alternatives. I also want to note that for the last 5 minutes of the presentation, we will have Paul Black from City Transportation give a brief overview of the downtown north-south connector, which is a proposed bike lane project, which will be adjacent to the park site. And as Lindsay noted, for the second part of the meeting, we'll be having an open question and answer forum. Please know that your comments and opinions tonight are very important to this design process. As such, following this meeting, there will be a survey sent out to all registered attendees. There will also be a link to this survey on the city's project website, as well as an email address and voicemail telephone number available for additional public input. The project site is located just north of downtown Raleigh along Capitol Boulevard. The site is approximately 14 acres in size and is currently a city maintenance facility. You may all remember the old red salt shed that used to be at the northern end of the site, which was once visible along Capitol Boulevard, and it was removed a couple years ago. The current park design scope is for this project to have the entire 14-acre site converted into a public park space. Specifically, the project scope includes site remediation due to soil and groundwater contamination, development of a natural and passive park, restoration of the Pigeon House branch, which runs along the western side of the site, and the first phase of the Pigeon House branch Greenway Trail connector between Crabtree Creek Trail and through downtown and down to Rocky Branch Trail in Dix Park. This project has been discussed for many years and was recommended in the 2012 Capitol Boulevard study and the 2015 Downtown Raleigh Plan. Since 2017, the project team has been conducting environmental site investigations to better understand the nature and extent of contamination at the site. While investigative work is ongoing, there are currently no indications that contamination identified on the site serves as an immediate risk to adjacent property owners or residents. However, implementation of a park at the site will likely require some remedial actions, which must be coordinated with regulatory agencies and considered in the park design. The current phase, initiated in December of last year, is for the conceptual and schematic design and for the public engagement to help us decide a preferred site design. It is very important to note that the final design and construction for this project is currently unfunded. City Council is currently working on determining which park projects and funding amounts will be included in the upcoming Parks Bond. As such, future funding for this proposed project is to be determined based on Council's final decisions and the public vote on the bond. Next slide. The project design team is composed of engineers, landscape architects, and environmental specialists. Tetra Tech is the lead consultant with design workshop and ecosystem planning and restoration serving as the main subconsultants. You will soon be hearing from Jonathan Smith from Tetra Tech and Emily McCoy and Lindsay Naylor, who you've already heard from Design Workshop. This team, along with Kevin Tweedy from Ecosystem Planning and Restoration, will be available for discussion and Q&A after the presentation. In addition to our general public engagement, we have a stakeholder committee composed of 14 members representing parks and local residential, community, development, and business interest. We met with this group just this past March. As mentioned, the current conceptual design phase started this past December. This winter and spring, concept plan alternatives have been developed and we have engaged with the internal city staff and our stakeholder committee. With tonight's meeting, we start our public engagement. Following this meeting and gathering of public input, we will present to the Parks Board in June, followed by a City Council presentation in July. Later this summer, based on feedback from all the alternatives, the design team will refine the concept plans. With future public engagement this fall, including a second open house, followed by additional Parks Board and Council meetings. Next year, the design will advance to schematic design based on the design alternative decisions made this year. This slide shows our project webpage, as well as links to our public input site, project email address, and voicemail number. This slide will be shown again at the end of the meeting, as well as emailed out to all registered attendees of tonight's meeting. As previously mentioned, there will also be a link to the survey sent out. If you do not get a chance tonight to ask your question or give comments, these other methods are ways to give your input to us, and we will work to respond to all questions via the project website. I personally thank you for your attention so far. Up next, our design consultant team will provide a presentation of the project site and review of design concept alternatives with discussion to follow. Thank you all.
Thanks, Gary. And we're going to start off, actually, I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll question. So you all should see a little window pop up with a poll asking, where do you live? And so we'll have 6 of these live polling questions over the course of the webinar. These are anonymous poll questions, but they'll just give us a sense of where you all are coming from and some of your initial ideas and preferences for Devereux Meadow Park. So I'll give you all just a couple more questions to answer. Where do you live? You can choose within walking distance to Devereux Meadow, in Raleigh, but not within walking distance, not in Raleigh, but in Wake County, or outside of Wake County. So I'll give you just a few more seconds before closing the poll. 3, 2, 1. Great, thanks you all. It looks like we have the majority of people on the call live within walking distance to Devereux Meadow, which is great. Thanks you all. I'm gonna stop sharing results, and you all can click the little X in the upper right corner of your poll window to get it out of the way so that you can see the slides.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Smith, Project Manager and Senior Engineer for Tetra Tech, leading the design consultant team in development of the design concept alternatives we're going to share and discuss tonight. I'm going to share some info on the site history before we're handing over to our lead park designer. Given its proximity to downtown, the Devereux Meadow site shares much of the rich history of the city of Raleigh. We want to focus of tonight's discussion to be on the site and the design alternatives we have prepared over the last several months. So we have prepared a short video presentation on the site history that you can watch at your convenience. This video will be posted to the project website, which Gary mentioned previously, by the end of next week. I do want to spend just a moment with a quick summary of the site history that we currently do know. Prior to European contact and during the early colonial period, the area of Devereux Meadow and the city of Raleigh was used by indigenous peoples with historical references at the time to its use as a hunting grounds. In late colonial and early American periods, the project site was part of a sequence of large land holdings. And then with the significant growth of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, the area around Devereux Meadow experienced industrial activity and associated residential housing for the supporting labor force. It was during this period that the project site was first referenced in newspaper articles as Devereux Meadow, or sometimes Devereux Grove, and used for community gatherings and other community purposes. And then in the 1900s, a baseball stadium was constructed on the site, hosting generations of Raleigh citizens and a variety of well-known and some not so well-known baseball players. The stadium was torn down in the 1970s, and the site has since been used as municipal parking area for and other uses for municipals. As you can see, the project site has a rather interesting history that deserves telling. We have reflected some of this history in the concept designs that we're going to share with you now, and we look forward to discussing it with you further.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hello, everyone. My name is Emily McCoy, and I'm a landscape architect and project manager for this project with Design Workshop located here in Raleigh on West Street, not too far from Devereux Meadow. I'm going to walk you through the design concepts for your review. But before we start the concepts, we wanted to set the stage for the concepts by reviewing the project background, the project site issues, and opportunities and constraints. First, we thought it would be helpful to go through the definition of a passive park. The vision for the park may include, with these definitions, passive open areas and walking paths, environmental and historical interpretation, natural stormwater treatment areas, daylighting and restoration of the Pigeon House branch, and a greenway connection from Crabtree Creek Greenway to downtown Raleigh. Here are some precedent images that show the experiential qualities of these potential programmatic elements, whether it be ecological restoration, providing access and interaction with the Pigeon House branch, site trails and site connections, gateways to the nearby neighborhoods, a promenade and large walking areas for people to gather and stroll, flexible gathering spaces such as open lawns, educational opportunities for site interpretive elements, whether those reflect the natural or cultural history, places for mental restoration and respite, and then we see extraordinary opportunities for integration of public art. So now I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay for another poll question.
Great, thanks, Emily. This is our poll question number 2. For this one, you can choose multiple options, but we're asking you to try and limit to just your top 3. So the question asks, at a future Devereux Meadow Park site, I or members of my household would be most excited about either walking the site trails, meeting friends or family to hang out at the site, using the open lawn space for play activities like playing tag or tossing a frisbee, people watching or relaxing along a main walkway or promenade, enjoying the sights and sounds of the restored stream, enjoying a nature destination within the city, enjoying public art, learning about ecological and stream restoration, learning about the history of the site, the city, and Pigeon House Branch, or passing through the site on the future Greenway connection. So I'll give you all just a few more seconds to submit your answers to that questions. 3, 2, 1. All right, thank you all. And so it looks like the most popular option was enjoying the sights and sounds of the restored stream, which is great, and then followed by walking the site trails and enjoying a nature destination with the city and enjoying public art. So thanks so much, you all. And I'll mention too that a lot of these questions show up in the online survey for the project that you all will be able to find on the project website. So be sure, if you didn't get a chance to get your answer in here, or even if you did, please be sure to go to the project website and take the online survey.
Thanks, Lindsay. That was great feedback. Now I'd like to walk through a few characteristics about the site as we know it today. Devereux Meadow, as many of you know, is north central downtown. These are 5-minute and 10-minute walk radii on the left-hand side of your screen from the park. This also on the right-hand side of your screen, the gray areas take into account walking distance from the other parks in the north central downtown area, whether it be Fred Fletcher Park, Halifax Community Park, and Mordecai and other places to the east. And you'll see here when we look at the existing parks, there's a white area where you see the label North Central Downtown, where there is a gap in walkable parks for those residents and community members in that area. This is another diagram. This is looking south, looking downtown. So north is on the bottom of your page, just showing that future Greenway connection through Devereux Meadow to a future connection to Crabtree Creek to north, which is at the bottom of your page, and then the Walnut Creek trails to the top of your page, which is to the south. You'll see here the various transit stops that are located near Devereux Meadow currently. And later in the presentation, as Gary noted, highlighted here in the icon with the number 1 on it, there is a proposed bike lane on West Street that Paul Black from the Transportation Department is going to give us an update. It's not a part of this project, but it is happening right now. And so we thought this would be a great opportunity to give you a little bit more information on those future plans. You can see here with number 2 that the proposed future Greenway Gateway to the north will start at Devereux Meadow as a part of this project, which is extraordinarily exciting. A couple other items of future items that we can expect to be coming from a transportation standpoint are the bus rapid transit along Capitol Boulevard, although there is not a planned stop nearby quite yet in this part of downtown, but something to keep an eye on for the future connectivity of the park. Here are some site views looking in and out of the site. So number 1 is showing an oak alley looking north away from downtown. Over top of Pigeon House Branch, there is a concrete cap over top of the stream in this area on the southern part of the site near Peace Street. There's a wonderful oak alley that exists, a line of oak trees of white and willow oaks that line that corridor within the park. Number 2 is just showing where the Pigeon House comes under Peace Street into the park on the south end of the park. Number 3 is just showing a typical condition of the stream. This is specifically showing the condition of the urban stream at Dorch Street. Number 4 is looking from West Street down into the park over, you can see the concrete cap here over the stone line channel of Pigeon House, and then the kudzu lined slopes on the right-hand side of your screen. And there are actually really nice views of the new Smoky Hollow development and downtown from the park in this area and along West Street. View number 5 is inside of the park. A little bit farther to the north, where you can see hints of the downtown skyline and Capitol Boulevard immediately to your left of the screen. Number 6 is just showing a look back towards West Street. We thought this was a significant photograph to show because this is where home plate used to be in the old baseball stadium, but you can see the slopes that go up to West Street in the background of the photograph. And then view 7 is a little farther north in the site where you're looking towards Capitol Boulevard. And this is important to note that Capitol Boulevard does get closer in elevation to the park elevation as you move north. And we'll show more examples and photographs of this as we move forward, but wanted to point out those significant views. This is an aerial drone shot of the site looking north. So we have Smoky Hollow here to the left, the bottom half of your screen. This is West Street, and then of course Capitol Boulevard on the right. You'll notice that the 100-year floodplain occupies almost the entire site boundary. So this is significant for what we can and cannot do on this parcel. And then also hatched on the left-hand side of your screen is the alignment of the current Pigeon House branch and its respective floodway. This next diagram is showing just some conditions of the site edge. Peace Street is an important site entry, as many of you all know, and given its the barriers of the railroad and the slope, these sort of north and south entrances are really important, particularly along Peace Street. Capitol Boulevard does define that eastern edge and does present constraints for sound and views for the park. It is also, as I noted earlier, the future bus rapid transit route. And what's significant, though, about Capitol Boulevard, particularly as you're driving to downtown from the north, the site presents a wonderful opportunity as a gateway that we don't currently have into downtown from the north along Capitol Boulevard. There's also a proposed alignment of a high-speed rail that may cut through the site. This is very far into the future, but right now those future alignments do show that alignment cutting through the north end of the site. And then of course we have the railroad to the west that does present a barrier to the Glenwood Brooklyn neighborhood immediately to the west. And as I mentioned before, we'll be talking about the future cycle track on West Street with Paul at the end of the presentation. We also do have significant utilities, and as Gary mentioned, some contamination that's being planned for remediation at this current moment. We do have a large sewer line that's noted and an orange dashed line that does present some constraints for what we can and cannot do. It is quite a large sewer line, and there are no sort of anticipated plans to replace that or to do anything significant to that. So we're hoping to leave that in place. There's also a few stormwater pipes coming from off-site into the site. Most notably is a large stormwater pipe from the Seaboard Station area that cuts through underneath the site about halfway through the middle of the site. Also noted in yellow are the approximate locations and some of the contaminations that exist that Tetra Tech has been monitoring over the last several years, which do present some constraints as well for us. And we do have overhead utility lines that we had to be cognizant of. And there is an elevated sewer line near Pigeon House on the north end of the site located here. We also have some wonderful historic relics of the site. We have the historic stone wall, the stone line channel of Pigeon House, but also the wall that served as the backdrop of the grandstand of the baseball stadium that still exists. We also, as I noted earlier, have a white and willow oak alley with very mature, beautiful trees that we'd like to preserve. We do have some conditions that create constraints, whether they be the steep slopes along those West Street properties that drop down into the site. We also have a culvert that serves as an access point about midway into the park that creates a pinch point for the stream. We also have significant stream elevation drop on the northern end of the channel. Of course, site impacts from Capitol Boulevard are most significant at the north end, whereas we drop a little bit in grade to the south and are able to be a little lower than Capitol Boulevard. So that does present some opportunities for us on the south end of the site. And we do have some steep slopes also on the east side of the site, with a little bit of a NCDOT right-of-way that's separating beyond the existing Capitol Boulevard right-of-way, where the old exit ramp is from Capitol Boulevard. And then we've just kind of outlined here the approximate former ball field alignment that where the ball field was back in the mid-century. So now that I've walked you through the design opportunities and constraints and site conditions, we'd like to walk you through the design concepts, which are really meant to offer programmatic options for you all to give us feedback on your preferences so that we can refine those into a preferred concept design. Before we dive into the concepts, which there are 3, we'd like to also just note that the concepts are a bit of a kit of parts that can be mixed and matched. So we'll be asking you questions in the survey and in some of these polling questions that speak more to getting feedback on different elements. So a lot of these can be mixed and matched. So don't feel compelled that you have to choose a concept, but rather elements of a concept. I will say that the stream options are sort of the backbone of the site concept designs. So we will be focusing on those primarily in the beginning of each concept so that it's clear how the approach to stream restoration really carves out the different programmatic options on the site for those program options. So some of these site conditions to pay attention to and differences between the concepts are not only the stream alignment and restoration, but also stormwater management, the landscape types and plant communities that are proposed. We also have different approaches to how we're treating the existing stone line channel of the Pigeon House branch. Also looking at site edges and gateway opportunities, treatment of the western edge, and then, of course, site experience differences between different scale and sizes of programs, different trails and greenway alignments, and then different approaches to public art and interpretive elements. So as I noted earlier, the stream restoration really is the backbone of the 3 concepts. So I'm just going to walk you through the differences between concepts 1, 2, and 3 for the stream. Concept 1 is essentially the lowest cost but lowest ecological uplift option for the 3 concepts. This basically stabilizes the stream in place, leaving the stone line channel as is, the side access road and the Dorch Street culverts remaining as is, and really just stabilizes the slope and gets a little bit more form and diversity in the stream channel to help repair it in place. So that's sort of the lowest cost, lowest ecological uplift. Then sort of the middle ground concept, which is concept 2, removes the concrete cap that I mentioned earlier that's over the stone line channel of Pigeon House branch, with a little manipulation of the stream alignment so that we can get a little bit more flood capacity in the floodplain itself along the Pigeon House branch. This would include some in-stream structures to develop bed form diversity. This is the moderate approach from a cost perspective and also moderate from an ecological uplift or restoration standpoint. Concept 3 is the highest cost and highest ecological uplift. So this would include total relocation of the stream alignment and profile to restore meanders that the stream once had pre the baseball stadium and reflects more of what a Piedmont stream typically does in this area as far as movement on the ground. The stream and floodplain design are based on bank pool hydrology and maximize floodplain connection and function. This has the greatest potential for visitor interaction, diversity and plant communities and habitat, and incorporation of stormwater treatment and flood capacity. Okay, so for each concept, I'm going to walk you through a schematic of the bones of each of the concepts and then walk you through the programmatic elements and the more illustrative drawings that help communicate the ideas in each of the concepts. So concept one is called line drive, and the forms of this concept are derived from the baseball stadium, whether it be sort of the infield alignments and views of the foul ball line, and really derive those view sheds and forms on those baseball connections. So here, again, this is where Pigeon House Branch is stabilized in place, minimally stabilized in place compared to options 2 and 3. The paths define a series of site-wide plazas, gardens, and gathering areas. Again, the concrete cap remains over the aqueduct, and this presents an opportunity to create a grand sort of promenade or large walkway to coincide with that oak alley that exists. And here, there's a little bit a different approach. So the orange line is the main greenway alignment, which is the main primary path. This is a little different than concept 2 in that in this option, the main greenway alignment arcs back towards Capitol Boulevard to provide a connection to future transit and other connections along Capitol Boulevard in the future, but also sort of lengthens the experience of the greenway to the east. So the orange line is that main primary walkway, whereas the gray lines are more secondary paths that add connectivity and connect people to different programmatic areas in the site. We are also proposing in all schemes, but with different approaches, a combination of berms and or beautiful graphic walls or different elements that help mitigate the impact of Capitol Boulevard on the northern end of the site. And so here we'd like to play off the outfield walls and recalls the Devereux Meadow outfield wall along that northern edge to present this beautiful gateway experience along Capitol Boulevard, but serving dual duty to mitigate some of the noise impact from Capitol Boulevard. So with that, I'll go into the illustrative drawing of the plan and walk you through some of the elements of concept 1. We've added some precedent imagery here. So I'm going to start at the bottom of your page, which is along P Street, to illustrate some of the program options that we have here in concept 1. So along P Street in this gray area, we've outlined an entry plaza gateway into the park that would then lead to where I talked about earlier, the existing oak alley and potential for a promenade or large walkway to connect to the overall circulation system within the park. As you enter the park from P Street, you can either go to the plaza or immerse yourselves through a open, flexible lawn space that then takes you to where the old baseball stadium was and the infield there. And there's a smaller gathering space derived from the forms and the geometries of that baseball stadium. There's opportunity too on that south end to present planting and a passive park experience along the edge of Capitol Boulevard, again, to help sort of mitigate the views and the sounds with vegetation to present more of a passive park experience as you enter from the south. Then as we go towards the middle of the site, and all of the options, we have the option to daylight the large stormwater pipe that's coming from the Seaboard Station area and clean and slow down that water in a constructed wetland system that would also have paths running through it and overlooks so that one could be immersed in that constructed wetland system or garden, if you will. We have some precedent images here of other cities that have done similar approaches to integrating ecosystem services like stormwater management and cleaning of water in their urban parks. This is a plug or play option and really does rely on the engineering detail that we'll be getting into with the survey and the remediation strategies. And if it weren't a constructed wetland garden, if we didn't daylight that pipe, it would be more of a vegetated garden experience rather than a water garden experience. And so that's something that we're looking for feedback on, but also something that will be designed in further detail later on down the road as we get into the technical drawings. There's also, as I mentioned, opportunity for berming, which are shown here in these darker green areas to help mitigate Capitol Boulevard in conjunction with a super graphic wall that is reminiscent of the outfill wall at Devereux Meadow Park. This is a section. So the section line is shown here in the bottom right-hand side of your screen, where it's about 2/3 of the way down to the south of the park, looking at potential future development, anticipated future development along the properties on West Street, what sort of approach we might have along that western slope to connect people from future development or from the neighborhoods to the west down into the park, but also allow opportunities for gathering along that slope shown there. Here you'll see the capped stone line channel or aqueduct that some refer to it as, and a concourse promenade that serves as a large gathering space in addition to a large walkway. We have some precedent image here that sort of reflects some of this character that we could imagine and experiential quality in concept one. Then here in the middle, of course, we have the preserved oak alley and then the outfield lawn that could serve as a flexible passive park experience in the middle of the site. Potentials for hammock groves and other experiential places for mental restoration and gathering as well. And also offers opportunities for celebrating some of the great baseball players that came through Devereux Meadow during its time and other site history that we may want to celebrate as a part of that experience in that Hammock Grove area. Here you see the primary greenway that's shown on more of the eastern edge and the potential berming that leads up to Capitol Boulevard, where we can plant those berms in addition to using landform to help mitigate. We're just schematically showing the groundwater elevations and the sewer line elevations below this section. Here are just some more precedent images that we felt really captured the ideas and concepts of concept one, whether it be MLK Park in France that has some wonderfully designed stormwater gardens as a part of that passive park, urban passive park experience, flexible gathering lawns, and then just places for people to gather and celebrate what all Devereux Meadow has to offer. So now it's time for another poll question from Lindsay.
Thank you, Emily. So for this poll question, we're actually going to refer to the grid of images that are on the following slide. And so just a reminder that you can move around your little polling window if you need to be able to see the images better. So this question asks, which of the following images best capture your vision for gathering spaces at the proposed Devereux Meadow Park? And so your options here, image 1 shows sort of an urban plaza overlooking a wetland. Option number 2 with an open lawn with room for events like movie screenings. Image number 3 that shows an example of a hammock grove for relaxing in the trees. Image number 4, which shows a little gathering nook that's set right off of a primary trail overlooking water. And option number 5, which shows a little bit more of a naturalistic stone overlook, also with views to the water. And so I'll give you all just a few more seconds to answer this question. 3, 2, 1. Thanks, everyone. And it looks like image number 5 with the sort of more naturalistic stone overlook was the most popular of these options. Thanks, you all.
Thanks, Lindsay. And again, to remove that poll question, you can just X out if you need to. All right, so we're going to move on to concept 2. This one is called Sculpt, and as you recall, this is the one where the stream is pretty much left in place with some additional stabilization in addition to concept 1 with a little bit more added flood capacity, carving out of flood capacity along the floodway of Pigeon House Branch. Here, we are removing the concrete cap on top of the stone line channel, which gives us a continuous view of the Pigeon House Branch throughout the site. We're also, as you recall, the orange line is the main circulation path system, also the greenway path and future greenway path. That would parallel Pigeon House Branch pretty much the entire way throughout the park. An opportunity here is to plant additional oaks on the other side of the path so that we could have a double alley since the existing alley would be on the western side of that path now. This presents wonderful opportunities for public art, hence the name Sculpt. And really here, since we're not re-meandering the stream, we're using the path system to be reminiscent of a meandering stream. And so you see these secondary paths sort of gradually meandering through the site and connecting at critical points in the adjacent properties. The sculptural berms, we're also showing berms on this scheme that mitigate the impact of Capitol Boulevard. And again, Pigeon House Branch is restored in place with increased stream bench and in-stream structures to help get a little bit more habitat diversity in that stream. Here is the illustrative drawing. I'll walk you through. There's a lot of similarities with concept 1, but the forms are a little different. They're a little more sinuous and curvilinear. So starting on P Street, there is an entry plaza that connects you to a large gathering lawn as you enter the site. You can then take a secondary path that sort of meanders up into this stormwater garden, constructed wetland area. And then the main path, the main circulation on the west would take you through that double alley of trees that I mentioned earlier. And then midway through the site, there's another opportunity for an entrance and a gathering space that connects you. Here on this scheme, we really want to use every opportunity possible to celebrate art, whether it be in a bridge detail or in a structure, a sitting structure along the sloped edge, or even signage and wayfinding, really highlighting public art in this concept. Here you can see just some of in the images, how that might look, those experiential qualities. And then of course, as in the other scheme, we do have these dark green areas where you have the berms. These berms would be more sculptural and artistic to reflect sort of this approach to public art as the main focus of this scheme. And here's a section that just communicates a little bit more. We also thought that there could be options to celebrate public art and the historic elements of the site, particularly the baseball field and then Smoky Hollow neighborhood and other elements as a part of that interpretive element through art. So you see here the proposed potential development along West Street, connectivity to those properties, or at least maximizing use of that edge as a gathering space. Here, the stone wall would be restored and an uncapped, and we would uncap that Pigeon House current cap so that the stream would have sort of a continuous view. You would have a view of that continuous Pigeon House branch through the site. The primary gateway is here on that western edge of the site with the new and preserved oak alley along the greenway. Here we have opportunity for landform and sculpture in the middle of the site with what we're calling an art meadow, and then secondary site trails to the east that meander a little more intimate with more planting as you get closer to Capitol Boulevard. Again, some images of experiences and programming elements that we might find in concept 2. And then a few more images, certainly not trying to redo or recreate any of these images, but just to give a sense of playfulness and inspiration through art as a part of the experience for Concept 2. So now I'm going to turn it to Lindsay for another poll question for Concept 2.
Thanks, Emily. And this one is another question that refers to images that show up on the following slide. I think that some people might be having a hard time seeing the images if they're on the mobile app. So I am going to go through these and give a little bit of a description so that hopefully you all can follow along and still participate, even if you're having a hard time seeing the images. So for this question, which of the following best capture your vision for public art and interpretation at the future Devereux Meadow Park? And the options here, we have image 1, that's a bright and colorful art piece that also acts as a wall to define park spaces. Image number 2, we have a little bit more traditional interpretive signage with images and text that can give information about site nature or history. Image number 3 shows a beautiful sculpture that's sited in a meadow off of a naturalistic trail. Image number 4 shows colorful sculptural pieces that also have educational value, perhaps by indicating stream and flooding levels. And then image number 5 shows art that's a little bit more whimsical and also incorporates creative lighting to create a really beautiful atmosphere on the site at night. So I'm going to give you all just a few more seconds to answer this question. 3, 2, 1. All right, thank you all. It looks like for this one, image number 5 with that beautiful art that's shown at night is the most popular option, followed by 3, the image of the beautiful sculpture situated in a meadow. Thanks, you all.
Fun, thank you all. We had a lot of respondents on that question, so thank you all for participating. Okay, last but not least, we're going to walk through Concept 3, which is called Meander. This is where we take Pigeon House Branch and re-meander the stream to create and carve different programmatic niches and areas throughout the site, and have pathways that follow that alignment. And so there's tons of interaction with the stream in this concept. It also gives us maximum ecological uplift and restores sort of a floodplain to more of a typical Piedmont flood condition. And so here, the primary greenway does sort of go back and forth between paralleling the stream or moving a little bit away from it. So on the south end, you're not quite paralleling the stream, but then you reconnect with it on the northern end of the site. The exposed stone aqueduct becomes a bioretention garden. So since we're moving the stream from taking it from P Street and moving it, meandering it to the east, it does leave the stone line channel in place. And this, because there are several pipes, stormwater pipes coming into that aqueduct, that presents a wonderful opportunity to reuse that as a bioretention garden, very similar to the MLA park that we showed earlier. In the dark gray, you'll note the secondary paths which follow and cross the realigned Pigeon House Branch, so that there's different levels of experience for getting close to the stream or being away from the stream. In this concept, there's also planted berms to mitigate the impact of Capitol Boulevard. And then I think that covers, the floodplain is slightly carved out so that we do get a little bit more flood capacity, more floodplain connection, and increased habitat health and visitor interaction. So here's the illustrative that shows that concept with a little bit more detail. So again, starting at P Street, there's an entry plaza experience that brings you through the site. That this is where you can choose your own adventure here, whether you want a small intimate path that sort of weaves through the restored riparian corridor, or a more active experience, more social experience that leads you to a larger gathering space about midway through the site that connects also with that potential stormwater garden where we talked about daylighting that stormwater pipe about in the middle of the site. Here are some just precedent images that reflect some of those experiential qualities that you could imagine as you move through the site. There's still opportunity for public art and other elements between all the concepts, but this is basically a more passive park experience that really focuses on the stream restoration and the stream ecology itself, but doesn't prohibit us from also celebrating historical interpretive elements as well. Here's a section that just shows some of those relationships that are very similar to the other concepts, with the main difference of having a stream more on the eastern part of the site that offers a little different experience, but still opportunity for landform and sculpting of land to provide different experiences in the middle of the site. Here are just some character images of parks, urban parks across the world that have similar approaches and similar contexts. A few more images. You'll see here image 5 that you all voted on earlier. That was the highest ranked image of the visitor experience that you all envisioned for the park. So with that, we have another poll question. Lindsay, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Emily. This is our poll question number 5, and this one gets at your big picture vision for what you think Devereux Meadow Park should look like. Your options here are, should it be a bustling urban green space with generous plazas and flexible spaces for gathering, pop-up events, and play? Should it be a peaceful escape to nature within the city with an emphasis on site trails, small gathering areas, and interaction with the stream and the natural environment? Or should it be a mix of both, somewhere in between those two, incorporating elements of both? So I'll give you all just a few more seconds to answer this question. 3, 2, 1. All right, thanks you all. And it looks like a little over half of you all said that it should be a mix of both. And 36% said that preferred that it would be a peaceful escape to nature, compared to 12% calling for a bustling urban green space at Devereux Meadow Park. Thanks you all.
Thanks, Lindsay. All right, so those are the 3 concepts. I'm going to summarize with some diagrams, the differences between the concepts, and then we will turn it over to Jonathan to do Q&A to go through some of the questions. So be ready with your questions. Please type those in the Q&A icon box when you get a chance, and we'll be sure to answer those here in a little bit. Okay, so in summary, stream alignment and stormwater management differ slightly between the 3 concepts, with the stream alignment being the major difference on between concept 1, 2, and 3. Concept 1 is the lowest cost, lowest ecological uplift. Concept 3, the highest cost, highest ecological uplift. And then 2 is sort of middle of the road, where the concrete cap gets removed, the edges are stabilized, and there's embedded a little bit more flood capacity. Here are just some sections showing those concepts in a little bit more detail to illustrate those points. So concept 1, stabilization in place, all culverts remain in place. The blue illustrates the channel, the main stream channel. The light green is where we would slightly modify the slope to stabilize the slope, and the thin dashed black line is the existing grade. So you can see what the differences are between the existing grade and the new grade. And then the blue is not showing water as it is all the time, but is illustrating Pigeon House Branch at approximately a 1.5-year flood level event. So Pigeon House Branch is not that inundated all the time, but this illustrates a flood event. So for concept 2, we have restoration of channel north of access culvert. So we are restoring the channel by removing that culvert and getting a little bit more capacity and shifting the profile and the alignment slightly to get us a little bit more bang for our buck from an ecological standpoint and from a stormwater and flood standpoint. So you can see here the dashed black line is the existing grade, and we're slightly cutting that in some areas to get a little bit more capacity in that channel. And then again, the blue area represents the flood event. Concept 3, the stone line channels left in place here on the western part, and then that remeander establishes an even greater floodplain width and gives us a little bit more capacity, but it does, move the channel to the east away from the West Street side of the property. And as I mentioned, the aqueduct is used for stormwater management. So we have one, or I don't know if this is the last one, I can't remember, but I'm going to turn it back to Lindsay for another poll question.
Yes, this is the last poll question that we have for you all. And this one is, of the 3 design concepts, do you have a preferred approach for restoration of the stream that runs through the site? So we have concept 1, stabilization and restoration in place with the lowest ecological benefit, but the greatest opportunity for investment in other site features such as plazas. Concept 2, with moderate ecological benefit and a balance between nature-oriented and urban site experiences. And concept 3, a new stream alignment and restoration with the highest ecological benefit and the most nature-oriented site experience. And then you can also choose no preference between the 3. So I'll give you a few more seconds to answer this one. 3, 2, 1. All right. Thanks, you all. It looks like we had just under 40, apologies for the train going by. It looks like we had just under 47%, just under half of you chose concept 2 with the moderate ecological benefit and a balance between nature and urban site experiences. And the least popular option was concept 1 with the lowest ecological benefit and maximum urban experience. Thanks, you all.
Thanks, Lindsay. Speaking of experiential qualities, that is the same train that goes by Devereux Meadow, so you could expect to hear the same sounds at the park. Okay, so moving on, just looking programmatically at the differences between the 3 concepts, there's not a huge difference between the 3 concept programs. It's more about their shape and their form and their relationships to adjacent programmatic elements. So you can see here in concept 1, we have these more linear forms, which lend themselves well more to linear programmatic spaces, but also is more about connectivity and gathering spaces at the crossroads of these secondary circulation paths. Concept 2 really celebrates at the south end of the site this flexible lawn space in this oval form with a direct connection to this passive art garden to the north of that flexible lawn space, with a plaza and overlook really centered with that stormwater feature in the middle of the site that also is a node of connectivity of various path elements. And then concept 3, very similar experience with more of a celebration of the stream and the hydrological function of the park, with that larger gathering space in the middle of the site overlooking that stormwater garden or constructed wetland garden, or just a regular garden, depending on the feedback that we get from you all on your preferred experiences and the technical aspects of the project. So that's programmatic differences. And then with circulation, the main path highlighted in orange, so whether or not the path sort of bends back towards Capitol, which will be the future Greenway path, and then reconnects north at Dorch Street back with the stream channel, or in concept 2, it parallels the stream channel, or in concept 3, it has a little bit of diversity in experiences where you're away from, but over the old alignment of the stream, and then reconnect with the meandering stream on the north end of the site. So before I move on, I'll just say also the survey that Gary provided a link to earlier, which is also on the city's website, gets into the detail of some of the feedback of these different programmatic, stream, and other elements between the concepts. So we really do hope that you take the time and encourage your neighbors and friends to fill out that survey. But just to reflect back on The schedule, we started back in December, and we have been working towards this important meeting today with a Parks Rec and Greenway Advisory Board meeting goal in June that we will be having, with a City Council presentation also in July. And then future elements here, City Council meeting number 2, and then schematic design based on a selected concept plan. And we're ongoing the site survey and those environmental investigations. Important to note, we'll be having a second open house, which I'm sure you're all curious about, in October. That date hasn't quite been set yet, but we're working on getting something in stone for that next October meeting, which will be taking all the feedback that we hear from you all through the survey and through our stakeholder groups and weaving that into a preferred concept design. So again, here's just some more information. The main project website you can find on the Raleigh's website. You could just Google Devereux Meadow Park and it will pop up as a first thing as well. But here's the URL for you. This is the home base for all information for the project. We'll also be looking for public comments and questions through publicinput.com. And there's an email set up where you can email your feedback to the city that will then be forwarded to the design and planning team, or you can use the phone number listed below with the project code 6331 and provide voicemail feedback if that's your preferred method of feedback. So with that, before we go into Q&A, I'm going to hand it over to Paul Black, who's a transportation analyst with the city, who's going to give us some updates on that north-south connector along West Street. So Paul, I'm going to hand it off to you.
All right, thank you. And I want to give a big thanks to the team for letting me tag along at the tail end of this meeting. This project has not officially started yet, but well, it may have actually. We're sending out the mailings. If they have not gone out, they will be going out later this week or early next week to let everybody along the corridor know that we are looking at creating some kind of in-street bike facility on this portion of West Street. The two examples you see, the one on the left is further south on West Street. It's part of the one-way pair of Harrington and West that goes from the warehouse district down near the Dillon all the way up to North Street. And we're working on phase 2 around Smoky Hollow as we waited for Smoky Hollow to finish up their construction. That is currently in design. Next slide. So this is part of a much larger corridor that will actually connect Dix Park, the Rocky Branch Greenway, and a little further south, the Walnut Creek Greenway and the rest of the regional greenway system through downtown all the way to 5 Points and the existing pedestrian connection that was built underneath Wade Avenue as part of the NCDOT project. So this isn't an isolated one-off kind of, hey, this is a great bike lane. This is part of a really important backbone of the bike system. Next slide. And final slide, I might add. So what we are looking at from a staff perspective, we wanted to make sure we had the smallest amount of impact to the on-street parking as possible. I think there was a question in the chat from Jeff Fisher about that. We don't know what the full extent is. This project is currently getting drafted by our on-call consultants. They looked at a couple of different options, and we're going to be looking at a two-way cycle track on one side of the street with the hope that we can preserve as much of the on-street parking as possible. We probably won't be able to maintain all of it. Again, everything is a trade-off, but we think this option is going to do a better job of keeping as much of the parking as possible. And again, this will go from P Street all the way up to Wade and underneath Wade to connect 5 Points into downtown and into the rest of the regional greenway system to the south. And that's it for me. If there's any questions, I'll take them with all the other questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, Emily, Lindsay, and Gary. And thanks to all of you attendees for sharing your evening with us and sharing your questions. We want to spend the remainder of tonight's virtual open house addressing those questions and gathering additional input. You've done a great job of providing questions, and we've been answering those in the Q&A session. Some of those questions are so good, we're going to answer them twice. If we aren't able to answer your questions tonight, we are going to attempt to address all of them and post again to the project website in the coming days. So what I'm going to do is just kind of cycle through some of these. The first question I want to ask that I want to ask, and I want to ask Gary Gary to address this to some degree is, what is the timeline for when we might start to see construction, and when do you envision we might have a fully viable park? And I'll kind of kick this off in that we, as Gary mentioned, there is currently not funding allocated for the project site. And we are also continuing to do environmental investigations and assessments of the site. Gary, do you want to add some additional context to that question?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I mean, as Jonathan indicated, there's a lot of moving pieces here. We have the fact that we're currently only funded right now for the current work that we're doing now, which is the initial stages of environmental investigations and schematic and conceptual design plans. That is actually funded by the 2014 Parks Bond. As you all may or may not know, there is an upcoming Parks Bond that will either be voted on later this year or early next year, depending on legislative decisions on when that vote should be. But there's also the fact too that the inclusion of this particular project in the Parks Bond is currently in the hand of City Council, and for how much and for what level of scope. So we have a lot of moving pieces here. I mean, in an ideal situation, this is a complicated project. There's a lot of environmental issues. There's going to be a lot of permitting involved with it. I would say at the earliest, you know, everything falling into place, we probably would not have any groundbreaking for at least 5 years. So, and then possibly even further than that, and this would be a possibly a multi-year construction project as well.
Thank you, Gary. Another question that's been asked: which concept allows most visibility of water? And I'm going to ask Kevin Tweedy to expand on this a little bit. One of the things I'll note, and it reflects what Emily had said earlier, we see all of these concepts as somewhat of a kit of parts. And there are two ways to visualize or have sight of water in the concepts that we provided. One is Pigeon House Branch itself, and the other is through stormwater management or treatment practices that we might have incorporated and did incorporate into those three concepts. So Kevin, you haven't heard Kevin's voice yet. He is our lead stream designer, and he'll be able to address the question about that.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I already typed a response in there, but I'll give a little more verbiage to it, I guess. Technically, kind of starting at the top and coming down, option 3 would have the most visibility of the stream because, as you noticed in the concept drawings, the stream is actually longer in that design approach. So there'll be, thank you, whoever pulled that up. There'll be more opportunities to probably visualize and see the stream under option 3. Option 2 would also have a lot of visibility of the creek as well. At least that's the concept they're working on. And option 1 would have the least visibility of the stream itself because under that option, currently part of the stream would still remain underground or capped over with that concrete cap. And then just as water in general, as Jonathan mentioned, some of the stormwater features that are shown here haven't been designed out yet, but those would also be water features that would be visible, particularly during wet periods when they're receiving water.
Thank you, Kevin. Another question that has come through is, will there be any historic signage to represent the history of the land as Devereux Meadow Baseball Stadium? And I think Emily addressed that to some degree, but we want to, or we provide, there's a capability to provide really any of the history of the Devereux Meadow Project site. As Gary noted in his response, we're still early in the design process, but we're looking for your feedback on what part of that history and how to best tell it within the context of these concept designs. Another question, and you guys have got some great questions here for me to address and answer. So I'm going to try to find here one. One question was asked is, will there be a grand entrance on Dorch Street side as well? And I'm going to ask Emily to address that. I believe we do show greenway connectivity at Dort Street, but Emily, what can you say about the option for a grand entrance at Dort Street?
Well, that's a really good question. We, as you can see in the illustrative drawings, we're not really showing a big entrance on the north side on the Dorch side street. But if that were something that we should prioritize, we can certainly add that to the preferred concept. And I think that's a good idea. You know, currently there's so much density and residences to the west and to the south and to the east. We did prioritize those connections, but we can certainly add a gathering plaza if that's desired on the north as well.
Thank you, Emily. Another question, would public art projects be delegated to the Raleigh Arts Commission for oversight and management? And I think that, Gary, you're probably best situated to address that question.
Jonathan, could you repeat that really quick? I just want to be sure I got the full question.
Sure. Would public art projects be delegated to the Raleigh Arts Commission for oversight and management?
So we do have the Raleigh Arts, which is a service division of Raleigh Parks. And with any public art project, they are certainly the partner, if not the lead, when it comes to art projects such as that.
Okay, great. So another question here, and this one I'm going to ask of Emily, and Kevin, if you have thoughts, you might jump in as well. It is, I love the idea of framing the past location of the baseball field with pathways, but notice that design concept was only in option 1. Are there constraints preventing that concept from being applied to option number 2? And I don't believe the answer is yes, but Emily, I'll defer that question to you.
Well, we in some of our stakeholder discussions, we did hear preference for straight paths and meandering streams, so a hybrid between 1 and 3 or 1 and 2. I'll let Kevin talk about any of the technical constraints with that approach, but I do think there is opportunity to hybridize those 2 approaches. And I just also want to note that we've been working really closely with the City of Raleigh's historians. And as mentioned earlier, we're collecting a lot of great history dating back to prehistory on the site that we'll be posting on the website next week. But nonetheless, I do think there is opportunity to represent and pay homage to the baseball sort of alignments and that history as a circulation defining form, whereas the stream could, do its own thing and meander and sort of criss and cross with those potential alignments. So I do think that's a viable strategy, but I'll let Kevin weigh in on any thoughts he has on mixing those 2.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, Emily. I think there's the potential to bring that concept into any of the 3 alternatives purely from a stream restoration standpoint. It'll depend on kind of where the exact channel is located and how much room is allotted for that feature. But I could see that being allowed for in potentially any of these 3 concepts. So I think it's a possibility.
Thank you, Kevin. Let me scroll. I had a really good one here. So we've had one question, and I've already answered it partially, but it is, what has been the source of the contamination and what is the impact to the creek? And so I'll spend just a moment talking about that. We are actively evaluating what the source of the groundwater contamination is on the project site. I do want to stress, however, and I think Gary mentioned this as well, that we have no indications at this point in time that contamination poses any threat to the adjacent property owners or landowners or the citizens of Raleigh in general. What it does represent is an area that needs to be addressed as a part of any sort of park construction. And so there was another question that I've seen here asking about, well, You guys are adding questions faster than I can scroll through them. Are there any concerns about option 3, which effectively routes Pigeon House Branch through an area of kind of known groundwater contamination? And we've certainly discussed that at length as a part of the project team. Part of the cleanup process may include excavation of those areas, so it actually may present an opportunity to take advantage of that excavation and work that's done as a part of potential cleanup, and actually see somewhat of a cost savings with option number 3. So we don't have any concerns about that. We're looking into those issues as we move through the development of these concepts. Another question here, would all 3 concepts still utilize the wall stone from Pigeon House Branch? I think this is referring to the aqueduct. And Emily, I'm going to let you address this, or have you address this one when you get a moment. But as you noted in options 1 and 2, most of that aqueduct is retained in place. And there are certainly options, or we're retaining it in much way in option number 3 as well. So there's a lot of opportunity for retaining some of those relic infrastructure components. We know there are portions of the old baseball stadium wall that are covered in kudzu right now, but those tell an interesting story of the project site as well. And so we are considering retaining some of those.
Yes, I'll just add that we're going to do our best to retain the stone walls as much as we can. We do need to have a structural engineer eventually look at those and make sure they're structurally sound, or what it would take to stabilize them if they are not structurally sound. But any relic such as the stone wall, we are making it a goal of our team to preserve those in place. And one interesting fact is that I just read recently through the historian's research that that stone was quarried just north of the site. The city back in the early 1930s had their own quarry in North Raleigh, and that's where that stone came from. And so I think that's also just a wonderful layer of story to add to the project's history. So we'll be doing our best to restore what we can within reasonable costs.
Thank you, Emily. We just got another question in, and I think Emmett is actually, well, it disappeared on me. I'll get to it here in a minute. Emmett and Kevin had been working on answering that. How wide would the creek be at its widest point? One of the things I'll note is just kind of characteristic of Pigeon House Branch. Kevin, I'll have you address this a little bit in just a moment. But Pigeon House Branch doesn't have a high rate of flow other than during rainfall events. If you go out there on a day when there's not active rainfall, you'll see a relatively a small amount of flow occurring in the channel. But during rainfall events, because of the very significant impervious area contributing to Pigeon House Branch, flows get quite high. In fact, you'll see flooding of even P Street at times. And so the stream design will have to incorporate, and reflect that very urbanized, very flashy nature of Pigeon House Branch. Kevin, can you share a little bit more on the proposed geometries?
Yeah, just from the preliminary design we've done, we're probably looking at a base channel there that's probably low 20s, maybe 23, 25 feet wide, up to maybe 35 feet wide, and some of the pools and wider sections. So that's sort of, if you envision it, that's sort of the main channel. And then, as Jonathan said, during larger storms, ideally the design would accommodate those flows spreading out onto a wider floodplain at a lower elevation, so we're not increasing flooding off the property or even flooding of the park facilities that'll be created. But that probably gives people a little bit of an idea of what size frame we're looking at.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And please continue to ask questions within the context of the question and answer session. We just received another one. What are the width and length of the park? And I honestly don't know it right offhand. And Emily, I'm not sure if you or Kevin or Gary knows, but we'll get an answer to that briefly. Another question here: have you considered adding riparian wetlands on the east side of the stream, perhaps integrated with the stormwater daylighting to give the site more stormwater storage for the city? So all 3 concepts do incorporate some level of stormwater management, really on both sides of the stream, primarily on the east side. And if you look at all 3 concepts, we've represented, at least conceptually, at least graphically, the option to incorporate some sort of stormwater treatment. Now that could take the form of a stormwater wetland, and I think that it wouldn't necessarily be a riparian-based wetland, although there will be, maybe Kevin can address the potential for riparian-based wetlands in a moment. There is a rather large storm drain sewer that enters into the project site from under Capitol Boulevard, and we're actively looking at ways we can integrate it into some sort of stormwater management. Complicating that process somewhat is that it happens to come into the site right in an area where our highest concentration of those groundwater contaminants exists. So, but we are looking at those options. Kevin, can you maybe speak to the potential for riparian wetlands or just the habitat function along the stream corridor itself?
Yeah, I think riparian wetlands are an option. I think we have to consider them carefully, at least in the context. So when I think about the term riparian wetlands, I'm thinking about wetland areas that would develop or be developed adjacent to the stream channel. So that certainly is a possibility. But I think we would have to do that carefully in the context of the aesthetics of the park and the function of the park, because those areas can tend to grow up kind of thick. So we may not want to encourage some of that in some areas, whereas wetlands for stormwater treatment are usually more maintained and can be more manicured and that type of thing. So yes, there's potential for that. I think we would have to think carefully how and where to use that, if I'm understanding the question correctly. And you mentioned, I think, ecological impact, Jonathan. I was getting ready to answer a question about that.
Sure.
There was a question about what is the ecological impact of redirecting the branch. So any restoration or redirecting of the stream channel that we would do would be done in terms of providing both increased stability to the channel, which is not very stable right now in the areas that aren't hardened, but also providing increased aquatic habitat and increased ecological value to the stream. So anything we're going to redirect will be done from a standpoint of increasing ecological functions and not decreasing or damaging them.
Great, thank you, Kevin. We've had a couple of questions related to parking, both on the project site itself and along West Street. I'm going to ask Gary to address those, but the sort of the synopsis of those questions is, are there going to be parking areas or parking spaces within the project site? And I'll just note that none of the three concepts that we've developed to date incorporate any parking within the park project itself. But Gary, if you're available, if you want to add some additional context to that information.
Certainly, Jonathan. This park, as it kind of is currently envisioned, is not necessarily really going to be considered a destination park like Pullen or Dix would be. It's really more a urban park, especially considering the fact that there is going to be more development around this site. A lot of the land that's on the west side of West Street, may over time be developed into more intense uses, and certainly envision downtown kind of like physically creeping more and more up into this site. So we do envision this, even though it is designed physically in many ways, at least based upon the concepts that we have, as a natural park. It is also going to be considered an urban park. So we do not envision necessarily there being parking on site, with the exception of accessible parking spaces, which is certainly something we would want to include. We do consider this park, maybe even though it's much larger than Moore Square, that's another urban park to consider, that there's not necessarily parking associated with it. But there would be opportunities for on-street or other type of parking available around.
Great, thank you, Gary. We had another question earlier, and I'm going to ask Emily partially to answer this, and it may also require a little bit from Kevin as well. And the question is, if I heard correctly, option one is best suited for flexible programmatic use. Is this because option one design elements or land use create the flexibility, or is this because the stream restoration cost is lower, so you assume more budget could be used for these other elements that is available for other options? My understanding is that it has more to do with option 1 just having more space. Options 2 and 3, we start to take up some of the space for stream restoration, particularly option number 3. And so option 1 creates more space for some of those more urban park elements. But Emily, if you can you address that or add any additional context?
No, I think you answered it really well, Jonathan. I would just add there is slightly a cost trade-off in that there are, you're able to invest more in those programmatical spaces, and you have more space because the stream is constrained to its existing alignment in concept 1. But no, you answered it great.
Okay, we do have a number of questions related to the bike path, and I think Paul is still online with us, and so I'm going to ask Paul to maybe address some of those. Paul, they're all over the place in the list here, so I'm not able to ask them all at one time. But I'm going to ask one here regarding the West Street cycling path. Will there be anything done to mitigate the impacts of the concrete plant for those who use West Street as their sole access? So.
Yeah, and again, the travel lanes will not be touched. There will still be a northbound and a southbound. Again, the only thing we think we're going to impact is parking. Now, if there's other things going on, if they need a turn radius to get in and out of the driveways, that's part of the public outreach we'll be doing all summer long, going out and talking to the businesses on the corridor to find out what their needs are and if there's things we need to do to accommodate that.
And I think one of the other questions, Paul, related to why do the cycle track on West Street when there's going to be a bike path in Devereux Meadow? And I will just point back to our discussion earlier in the question about schedule and funding, in that there's no certainty or set schedule for when a greenway would be constructed at this project site. And so I suspect that's going to be your answer, but I thought I'd give you an opportunity to add additional information.
Exactly. That's half the answer. We were actually ready to put it on the ground this summer, and we realized we had some issues, particularly down at Peace Street with the bikes that are on the wrong side of the road coming south, having to cross. And we've got to do a little extra work there and do a little extra engineering and research. Also, in talking with my counterparts in parking, they said you really need to go out there and talk to the community and make sure you're mitigating the impacts of that parking. So we're going to spend the summer dealing with those two issues and see what comes out of it. But like I say, we're ready to go. We can have this on the ground pretty quickly once we get the engineering part ironed out and we've tried to mitigate whatever impacts we can with the community. The other one, though, is technically greenways still close at dusk, which for bike commuters, especially in the winter months, doesn't always work. We know this around Meredith. We have this issue on the Rocky Branch Greenway now. So this gives an extra option, and maybe some people would have some personal security issues in parts of the park. Maybe they don't feel like it's visible and they're not seen, particularly after dark. So again, this gives a second option for folks who maybe would have issues with that. And if you have to close the sewer line or close the greenway for any reason, I've got a detour ready to go.
Paul, before we move on, are there any other questions that you've seen in the Q&A window that you want to address at this time?
Just in general, a lot of pedestrian connectivity issues around the railroad to the west and Capitol Boulevard. The railroad to the west, particularly with high-speed rail coming in and widening that corridor and doing other things to the corridor, is going to make that a really difficult lift. Capitol Boulevard, trust me, it's not for lack of trying. It's just with the railroad yard, also on the east side of Capitol, and some of the topo issues, and then Pigeon House Branch. I mean, it's just a trifecta of all the hardest things to cross, all three right there together. Really, our best chance is probably up near the Wake Forest Road interchange. It's just going to be the nature of the beast, I think, in this part of the city. I mean, nothing's impossible, but we know what funding is. It would really take a unicorn dropping out of the sky to make something like that happen. Or more likely, a unicorn in the way of federal funding dropping from Washington or something like that. I'm being funny, but no, I mean, again, staff have looked at it. It's highly requested, and it's just physically very difficult, difficult in terms of permitting, and would be extremely expensive to do.
And we similarly had questions related to access back across Capitol Boulevard. I think one of the questions was the only access point from the, from the east, the only access point from areas to the east of Capitol Boulevard via P Street. And Gary or Emily, either of you have any insight or additional information to share at this point? You know, we're not anticipating any sort of crossing of Capitol Boulevard. And so that point at P Street or perhaps to the north would be really your primary means of access.
Yeah, this is Gary Claiborne. At this time, Jonathan, you're correct. That is probably the only realistic access points at this time. So.
So another question that was asked related to water quality is Pigeon House Branch isn't exactly clean. How do you integrate it into the park and keep it from being a flow of grossness? And I'd like to congratulate this person for asking a question that contains my new favorite term of art. I'm going to use that in the future. And Emmett had already addressed this to some degree in the question and answer, and that you know, by the use of some of our design elements, including in-stream structures and stream gradient, we can protect the stream from degradation. Now, what we can't do is remove, you know, trash and debris that might flow down through the stream corridor, but that's, you know, already in Pigeon House Branch as it is. And through the implementation of some of our stormwater management practices that Emily noted as she went through the 3 concepts, we are able to help the city to improve the water quality of Pigeon House Branch and provide that ecological uplift that Emmett and Kevin or that Kevin had mentioned previously when he answered a prior question. Another question that's come up, and Gary, you might be able to address this one. It's a question related to the city-owned property to the west. And I believe this refers to, really it's a portion of the parcel that currently the project site sits on the west side of West Street, and how that might change and what its relevance to the park is, whether that could be a potential addition to the park or some other city use. And I'm not privy to any of those discussions and they certainly haven't been a part of the park plan at this point. But Gary, do you have anything to add or that you can share about the current thinking for that particular city property?
I'm going to be honest. I am not really privy myself of any discussions of that. That is currently used by the police department right now. My understanding is too that the plans for the future high-speed rail may or may not potentially impact that site. But in the end, that is a city-owned property, and it has not been designated as a parks property. So it's only the 14 acres on the east side of West Street, which has been designated as future parks property.
Thank you, Gary. So another question here, and I think it's going to be perhaps Emily and perhaps you, Gary, address it, is how will you focus on orienting the park towards increasing walkability in areas to the north and east? Now, we've talked a little bit about the area to the east and the difficulty with Capitol Boulevard, but how about to the north? Is there, other than the connections that we provided, is there anything additional to share on that connectivity to the north?
I do not at this time have anything to share on that. We do have, as part of the internal city design review team for this, we do have folks in the urban planning and transportation folks that are in charge of reviewing this and kind of coordinating their projects with this. And that's certainly something that I will I can address that question to them, and we can include that in a future response.
So we've still got a few more questions coming in, and I'm going to ask that my fellow panelists, Gary, Emily, And Kevin, if you have a question that I haven't asked that you see in the chat or in the question window that you'd like to address, just go ahead and jump in now. We've got nearly 100 questions here, so I'm having to scroll back and forth to make sure we get to the ones that we want to address and make sure we're answering all questions that come in.
I'll answer the one that asked where the stone quarry is or was in North Raleigh. I'm not sure, and maybe Celeste or others in the city historians can help answer that question in the future. But the newspaper article from the 1930s, when it talked about the construction of the stadium, just noted that it was north of the site. So that was all the information that was in the article. But perhaps there's somebody on the call or someone that's a historian with the city can help us find that answer, and we'll get that for you on the next time we join or together, or perhaps on the city's website where we're going to post answers to the questions.
And Emily, another question that just came in is, can we give an elevator speech summary, a very brief summary on the high-speed rail plans? And perhaps if you can change the view that we're sharing with folks back to that particular image that showed the high-speed rail flyover, we can share a little bit more about the impact and how that relates to the park setting. And while you're changing your slides, I'm going to scroll up and find another question to perhaps ask.
Okay, and that may be best for Paul to answer or Gary. I think they're more in tune with those alignments and future plans than perhaps I am. Paul, would you feel?
That one's a little outside my wheelhouse. I just know it's actually closing some other crossings further south in downtown. So again, trying to do things on the west side is probably going to be hemmed in by what's happening with the high-speed rail. It's a pretty big project, and I don't think getting across is going to be an easy thing to do.
What I can do just really quickly for the person that answered that, I'll try to find their, the railroad company has conducted a study. I might try to find that real quick and put that in the Q&A for you all.
Thank you, Emily. Here's a question that I'm going to ask. And it's probably all of us will answer it to some degree in the panelists. Curious to know which of the three options minimizes the area of the park that is out of bounds, meaning that it's marked off and doesn't allow entry. And so, you know, one of the things you can see from the representations of the park in the three concepts is we do have a lot of connectivity for the greenway and a lot of walking paths. We're currently determining what level of contact would be best for the stream itself. So one of the concerns and considerations that we're evaluating is the impact of the contamination and how that's remediated and dealt with, and does that mean that we need to, you know, perhaps limit access to the stream? There may be reasons to limit access to the stream for health of the vegetation, or just from a safety perspective. But I'm interested, Emily or Gary, if you have any other thoughts on that particular question, as far as, are there any areas that you think will be limiting access to? I can't really think of that being a part of the component of the design at this point.
No, I think what that question also sort of speaks to are the cordoned off areas that may be keeping people off planted areas, or I can't speak specifically to that, making sure that's exactly what the person intended. But I would imagine there will be a maintenance area where maintenance staff will need to have their equipment that won't be open to the public. But other than that, we're hoping to embed a resilient design and resilient planting so that it is accessible and offers those passive experiences. So I don't imagine any large areas being cordoned off as a part of this project. And given the size of it, I think it allows us to disperse people throughout the site so that we're not having too much concentrated foot traffic in any one area, except for the lawns, which would be designed to handle the foot traffic. So, Gary, I don't have any specific other comments there other than perhaps maybe a maintenance area, but that would be the extent of the unrestricted areas.
Yeah, Emily, I do agree with you that I can't imagine restricting too many areas within this park. Just the way that it's kind of like been designed, it's really meant the design intent, I believe, in probably all three options is not to just restrict people to the pathways. You know, they invite people out into open lawn areas, into other areas of the park. The way I kind of almost visualize it is just think of Fletcher Park right now. Yeah, there's lots of pathways in and around it, but at least when I'm at Fletcher Park, I don't spend too many times on the paths. I'm walking around the grass areas as well. So not necessarily saying the parks will be designed like Fletcher Park, but in terms of the way that people can access the different areas, I think it's very similar.
Another question.
Yeah, hey,
go ahead, Kevin.
I was just going to add or tack on a little bit. There were a couple questions about safety as well, and I kind of think they kind of go together a little bit here. We don't have a specific design approach yet. We've talked about the different options, and obviously as we get into formal design, safety, public safety is going to be a big consideration for any design that goes forward. So in regards to interaction with children, even adults, with water features, safety would certainly be one of the key things that we're looking at as we push any design forward. So there are things we can do to encourage interaction with water and discourage interaction with water, and ensure that water depths are shallow, even from the stream. I mentioned earlier 20 to 30 foot channel sounds pretty big, and that is kind of wide, but in general that channel would be pretty shallow. So making sure we don't have any deep water areas and that type of thing. And if there's any concerns about water quality, there are things we can do to discourage people interacting with the water itself as well. There were some questions about swimming and that type of thing, and probably not something that'll be encouraged at the park. But that we're some ongoing studies and analysis going to kind of figure that out better.
Yeah, and I think it's important to add that for both Pigeon House Branch and these stormwater treatment facilities that we're discussing, we're not talking about big, large ponds or lakes. We're talking very shallow depths of water, both in the stream itself during base flow conditions, and also within treatment systems as well. So things like kayaking and swimming wouldn't be a part of the capabilities or things that could be done in those. But however, there's a lot of ways to still interact with that water and riparian habitat. And Gary mentioned Fred Fletcher Park, and there's a wonderful stormwater wetland there. Something similar to that is perhaps what we're thinking for among the options that could be done here at Devereux Meadow.
Yeah, I think too, in terms of safety too, and looking at how you could restrict access to some of these quote unquote unsafe areas, that does not necessarily have to be done with fencing or anything like that. You can do that with planting design.
So we just had another question that come in. Is there any benefit to beginning the daylighting of Pigeon House Creek now? And I'll let Gary and Kevin address this to some degree, but part of the reason to do it all at one time is cost saving. There's a cost savings of doing all your construction at once. And the other is, because we're actively looking at the known contamination on the project site and best tailoring any remedial action to what the long-term park use is. Once that is defined through this process, then we'll have a better idea and understanding of what's what's going to be required as a part of that. So certainly there's would be a benefit from an ecological standpoint, but from a cost effectiveness standpoint, it would be better to do this all at once.
Well said. I got nothing to add to that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Certainly cost is a huge issue because, I mean, you want to permit this as a single project and you want to bid it as a single project. And we have discussed this internally that, when and if we do receive funding for the construction of this, we do see this as being a non-phased project. It's going to be something we're going to do at once and do everything at once. So.
And there was another question, and Emily, this I think would go to you, asking about the historic map that was included in the history presentation. And I know we have additional imagery, both photographic and mapping in the history video that we're going to be sharing next week. But could you point that person to where those maps might be found, those historic maps that were part of the history presentation?
Sure. It's a combination of the state archive, NNO, but that historic map was through, I believe, and we're, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to do a longer video on the history of the site, which will have a PowerPoint presentation that lists the sources of all of the images and the maps that we'll have. That old, I believe it's 1893 map that shows the Civil War fortifications around Devereux Hill. That was through the UNC archives, and that will be listed on the history video for you all to find. It's also known as I'm not sure how to pronounce this person's name quite properly, but I think it's GINON map, which was the original surveyor that drew that map in 1893. But we'll list that reference on when we show the history and show that map again. But it is publicly accessible through the UNC Historic Map Archive. Also, NC State has a great link to historic maps through the state archiving imagery hosting that they offer. So I don't have the name right off the top of my head of the website, but we can make sure that that's a part of the presentation for those that are interested. But you can download without paying. It's free to the public. Very high quality historic images, particularly of that time period of the 1890s, that are quite interesting. That I encourage the history buffs out there to check out. It is pretty cool. And it looks like some folks maybe are posting some information on in the map that are more in tune with the history than I am.
And if you've shared information in the question and answer in response to a question that you've heard, we'll do our best to incorporate your information that you're sharing back as a part of our response, so that all participants can see that. We had another question, Gary, and it's lost in the shuffle here somewhere, but I'll try to recall it accurately. Wondering if the city was looking at the private parcels to the north of the project site as a potential expansion for the park. And I know that's not a part of what we've discussed as a part of our ongoing conceptual designs or plans, but are you aware of any discussion at the city as far as those properties are concerned?
There has been no discussion of that within the Parks Department for acquiring those properties. So at this point, the way that we are viewing this project is it is as delineated on the plan that's shown right now by the white outline, which is the 14-acre site, and that is the park project. I will add to that. I will kind of add to that. As mentioned, this park is going to be part of the connector Greenway path. So more than likely, this will be the first phase of that Greenway connector path, and it won't necessarily be connecting to the north and the south until later. So So that is the only other quote unquote potential expansion of the park would be along the future Greenway corridor.
Thank you, Gary. And we've got, just want to note for the attendees, we do have about 10 more minutes, 11 more minutes of our discussion and dialogue here. So if you have any questions that you've been eager to ask and you haven't heard them answered, please feel free to add them to the question window. We'll do our best to answer them. And again, I'll ask the remainder of the panelists if there are questions that I haven't gotten to, or you feel like we haven't quite addressed, or even if you just want to add some nuance to a question that that maybe brings up something else to discuss. Feel free to jump in here so that we can make sure to address all the questions as completely as possible.
So there was a question, I honestly can't find it right now how it was worded, but there was a question that if there's been a concern about the Devereux family name in its history. And as you will see in the video that should be coming out next week on the history of the site, for those not in the know, the Devereux family name does go back to the 1800s, and the Devereux family are associated with the Mordecai family and the Lane family, which are obviously all associated as being former plantation owners. So the land that the site is on was at one time part of the Devereux family plantation, as well as much of the surrounding areas. And the Devereux family still owned the land for some time following the Civil War as well. And over time, the land was sold off in the early 1900s, as you'll learn in the video too. Before the actual minor league ballpark was developed, this site was a park as well. It was called a Devereux Playgrounds, but it was called several other terms. But it had playground equipment in it. There's indication that there was probably tennis courts there, that there was a field there that was used for high school football games and such. And the name at that time was Devereux, and it continued to, when the minor league ballpark was constructed, to be continued to call Devereux Meadow. And that's the name that's kind of continued and in some ways leapfrogged over the current use as being a city maintenance facility to this project name right now. So we are very well aware of the family history name. And what I can say to that is that the city would be open to potentially renaming the project in the future park. And we are going to be looking at investigating ideas for how that new renaming could possibly be done, and to certainly find out what type of public support there is for such. And so I would invite, even though there's not necessarily a question specific in the survey regarding this, there are some open commentary boxes within that survey. I would invite anyone who has concerns about the name of the project to certainly put their comments in those open commentaries. We also have the email address that's indicated, as well as the voicemail phone line. And so we have many different ways that you can communicate any comments regarding that. So just to reiterate, in the end, ultimately, it would not be a park staff decision. It would be a decision that would be initially recommended by the Parks Board and then going to City Council for any renaming efforts. So thank you.
So another question, and I think this is probably best answered by Emily and Lindsay. Will the sidewalk along Capitol Boulevard connect with Devereux Meadows somehow?
Yes, we have some secondary connections that would connect to that sidewalk. It's easiest to connect to that sidewalk if you're looking at the screen, to the north, where the grades of the park and the grades of Capitol Boulevard come closer together. And so we'd like to have an accessible connection there, which will be closer to Dorch Street than to Peace Street. But we do intend on having at least one, if not more, connections to Capitol Boulevard sidewalk.
So another question that's come in, and this doesn't necessarily relate to our work, but I'm curious if any of our panelists know the answer to it. Do you know if the railroad west of West Street will be fenced off on either or both sides? Now that's outside of our project bounds and not part of our overall concepts. But I don't know if the city has any plans. Portions of the city property border that. That's really a decision primarily by the adjacent landowners and the railway.
I'll just add really quickly. Also, I'm not sure. I think everyone can see it, but I did. The U.S. DOT, Federal Railroad Administration, does have the environmental impact statement for the Southeast High-Speed Rail. I did post a link to that in the question and answer. I hope that everyone can see it. If not, if you go to railroads.dot.gov and search around for the Southeast High-Speed Rail EIS, which is short for Environmental Impact Statement, you can get more information there about the proposed alignments and the environmental impacts that they studied as a part of that project.
Thank you, Emily. We've got just a couple of more minutes here, and I'm going to again invite my fellow panelists to answer any questions or ask any questions that haven't been addressed yet. I think we've covered most of your questions. There's a number that are sort of asking the same question that we may have already addressed, so I'm not going to bring those up.
We do have someone who has noted that maybe there was a small quarry at the intersection of Glenwood and Oberlin where the Harris Teeter is now. So hopefully we can get an answer to that question, but it seems like we have some leads here on the quarry.
One question is asking, might the light plus time tower be moved to the park from the Capitol Boulevard median nearby? I'm not fully in the know on the current plan for that, but Gary, any thoughts or has there been any discussion of moving that tower?
No. I think that's the answer. That's the first I've ever heard of that. So I will certainly forward that comment to our Raleigh art staff, though, and we'll let you know how they respond.
Emily, in the last couple of minutes that we have here, can you again share the slide showing the project website and the contact information for anyone who didn't get a chance to write that down earlier in our open house? And we'll leave that up for a couple of minutes as we wrap things up here so folks can jot that down if they'd like to. So Gary, one question that you answered in a written form related to the passive park definition and the potential for electrical hookups, festivals, restroom facilities. That's a question that we've had come up in some of our earlier discussions with stakeholders. And so, the question you've addressed there is that's kind of to be determined yet as we continue to work through the concept designs. But do you want to share just a little bit more information on that in case that person is still on the line?
Well, I guess first and foremost, we need to, I think, reemphasize the fact that this site is 80% plus floodplain, and certainly the way that we're designing this park is to accommodate that future flood flow. So with that intention, we know that limits what can and cannot be built there. And so that's why, that's one of the reasons we really went with the passive park type overriding theme for this particular project. Now, things such as electrical hookups, which could be used you know, we certainly, in some of the plans, we do have large plaza areas, and there could certainly potentially be, based upon how we get responses from this public engagement and responses that we get from the Parks Board and City Council and such. You know, there could be potential for food trucks or something like that, or other events in the future. And so you would expect that there would maybe need to accommodate for that, particularly with electricity. Now, whether restrooms would be something like a permanent structure or just a temporary structure for such events, that again is to be determined. And obviously any structure would have to be built to accommodate potential flooding. So that's a more of a very fine tooth detail that would be not necessarily addressed per se in the concept design, but could be addressed in the schematic design, which is the next phase of work, which would be starting next year. But certainly, you know, we're open at this point to any and all comments, and, you know, for whatever type of uses or particular programmed or non-programmed spaces that people may want. I want people to feel free to put in the comment box or to email us, you know, with whatever their vision for this park could be, and we'll certainly take all those into consideration as we advance the design. So.
Thank you, Gary. And by my clock, we've hit the 9 o'clock window. We're still going to be available to answer any additional questions, but I think we've addressed most, if not all, of the main questions that come through our question and answer function. We will, as I noted earlier, provide additional written response to as many of those as we can and post them on the project website. Gary or Emily, anything additional to share before we close out as we see if any additional questions come through?
Yeah, I just want to be sure if anybody does feel like their question has not been responded to, if they can put in the Q&A right now, you know, their name and just maybe either reiterate the question or let us know maybe how high up on the list it was. We can certainly try to address that. So I'll give everybody I'll give everybody a little bit of time just to kind of respond to that. I just want to be sure everybody's immediate question was addressed.
Thanks, and I'll just end by saying it's great to have so many participants. I think at one point we had about 130 people on the call, and we still have about 50 of you all that have hung on like troopers through this 2-hour meeting. So we really appreciate your feedback. And please share the links with your neighbors, your family, and others so that we can get as much feedback as possible on the survey. It is really important that we hear your preferences and your vision for the park. So please pass along that information, and thank you for your time this evening.
Okay, I just do want to follow up on Matthew's question regarding the light and time tower. I personally am not very aware actually of that piece of art, maybe because I drive by myself at 50 miles per hour as well, and I don't necessarily have really seen that that tower. You know, we certainly do have a very active arts program within our parks, and it's something that we continue to grow over time. And as I said, I think I responded to Matthew originally, is that something I'll certainly pass along to our Raleigh art staff and let them know that. So
I just want to thanks again for letting me tag along with the parks meeting. For folks who are interested in the bike lane, expect to see us. There will be a number of events that we'll be bringing forward over the course of the summer. So you don't have to worry about sending the bike lane questions to the parks folks. We'll be around pretty soon.
Okay, and I want to just send a big thank you out to Jonathan for moderating the questions. Thanks to Emily for a really great presentation on the design. Thanks to Lindsay for kind of like coordinating everything behind the scenes and working on the pop-up questions. Thanks to Kevin for all the responses dealing with stream work. And don't think I left anybody out, but and thanks to Paul for kind of like tagging along and kind of providing some additional information on a project that's adjacent to this. So with that, again, just reiterate, please, everybody, if you get a chance, go over the survey, respond. I think it's a very good survey that that our design team has put together. There's graphics associated with it, so you can always have some reference points to go back to as you answer the questions. And with that, just want to reiterate too, again, we're going to the Parks Board in June, City Council in July, and then we're going to have our second open house in October. And I certainly hope that you all will attend. And since we have your email addresses, you'll all be getting special invites. So with that, again, thank you very much, and have a great night. And we will respond to any questions that we did not answer in written form, and that will be on the project website. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Bye all.
You-
Bye, everyone.